if I were a little more flexible in how I give a talk, I'd say David Pogue's presentation was fantastic. Let's throw this away and we'll design an evaluation around NOVA now, right now, here with all of you. We'll think about what the outcomes should be and what we should care about and how you would actually go about taking that anecdotal evidence that he showed us and turn it into real hard social science data that you can use to convince a funder who is skeptical or a community that says, well, it was a lot of oopsa, but what really comes out of that, aside from the kind of self-selected potentially things that you've shown us. But I'm not that flexible, so I'm giving my talk. So my talk is why is systematic evaluation so rare? That's the first part of my talk. And there's a lot of stuff that I put in between, hopefully addressing a bunch of stuff that's been addressed, including the kind of platform question, when and how and in what ways science-based professionals, how I'm going to call them, have an opportunity to actually communicate with the public. And then at the end, I come back to how can we make it the norm. But before I do all of this, I want to dedicate my talk to a dear but uninvited guest to this colloquium, which is, this thing doesn't really work so well. Musca domestica, which clearly nobody had caught yet, but here it is. I actually saw it flying around. It's still here. Briefly speaking, systematic evaluation, what actually is that? But the first question is, why should we do a systematic evaluation when the alternative really is we can wing it, right? Have we heard that yesterday? No, we shouldn't be doing this, right? That was the idea. If we don't wing it, what does it mean if you don't wing it, which was said yesterday we shouldn't be doing and has been repeated over and over. We should actually use evidence to not only design what we're doing, but to actually ask ourselves the question whether it works. And it's easy to ask whether it works. I give you an example of that. I took a friend of mine to a planetarium at one point. I used to work in a planetarium to see a show. And she didn't really want to go, but then we saw the show and it was so incredibly boring. For an hour it was pearled on a string on another thing you ought to know about the night sky. And at the end of the show I went back to the lecturer, it was a live lecture, and said, how do you know this is working? And he said, I've been doing this for 17 years. And every time after the show somebody comes to me and tells me how wonderful it is. I thought, I hope you all see what the problem is with that. So really, the first thing I want to address in this talk is what is actually evaluation, because it's different from research, if you know research. Then what is it for? And that has a lot to do with the idea that before you do an evaluation, before you ask yourself, what am I evaluating? I need to figure out in a way, what is it I'm creating? What does it do to the people I'm addressing? And what does it all end up to? So it actually means I have to think a little logically about what I'm doing, which is probably the most valuable part of an evaluation. One of the things I would claim here is that a lot of particularly natural and physical scientists and even social scientists who are engaged in these efforts do not really know much about evaluation. Funny thing is, they're using something very similar to a degree in their own research, but as we've heard again, if you cross disciplinary lines, you leave your scientific background at your discipline, and then you go somewhere else. The other thing I think is a lack of trust that we've just seen a little bit is, does this material, does this kind of research, social science research, educational research and so on and so forth, actually tell me anything that's useful that I don't already know? The more problematic part is the fear of knowing, which is, and if it tells me something useful, do I actually want to hear it? Which I think is a bigger problem. And then at the end of the day, there's the inability of doing anything about it. So what good does it do if I hear that something I should be doing differently, if I A, don't know how to improve what I'm doing, and B, actually involved in this, I don't know how to go about finding out in the first place. In that sense, something was missing. Anyway, in that sense, one thing I want to mention is that the notion, particularly when it comes to educational or outreach activity, that I go systematically about designing how I do my outreach or activity that goes about talking about science to the public or the media and so on and so forth, that I go systematically about this is not how most people think. This is not how we create either educational or outreach activities for the most part. I want to talk a little bit now about two projects, the Current Science and Technology Center at the Museum of Science in Boston, and the Portal to the Public Pacific Science Center-led project out in Seattle and now in 9 other places in the United States, as examples for systematic approaches, model-based approaches towards engaging researchers, scientists, science-based professionals in communicating to the public current science in ways that the public can understand for various different audiences. And I will talk a little bit about the evaluation that accompanied that, made these projects better, and then documented that these projects were actually doing what for who. I'm not saying they're successful. Point of evaluation is not to prove success necessarily. It oftentimes is more complex than that. One thing that this talk is not about is somebody is invited. We heard the Educate to Innovate project. There's a huge website that connects scientists to teachers and invite them to come to the classroom and give a talk. This is not what I'm talking about here right now. If you are invited to give a talk at your teenager's class, and maybe it should more look like this, then by all means talk to your teacher, find out what they really need to know, engage with them, and so on and so forth. This is a different kind of story, but I would actually say if you're invited to do that, still you need to figure out who's your audience, how old are these kids, what can they understand, is my PowerPoint that I normally do even understandable to the colleagues that I'm normally giving it to, how is it about 7th graders? Questions like that, but this is not the part of systematic evaluation. I'm talking about bigger programs that address these issues. Now, the next thing is, when do I actually do evaluation? Evaluation is not equal evaluation. There are actually various kinds of activities around evaluation that one needs to disentangle a little bit. The first thing here in the middle is any kind of communication activity. We haven't really talked much about what we mean here in this room. There have been discussions about people giving talks to the public versus talking to the media, and there are lots and lots of other activities that we can think of that scientists might engage in and other people might engage in to communicate science in some ways to the public for all sorts of different purposes. We haven't really mapped this, but let's assume one of these. The first part in evaluation is oftentimes distinguished in the different terminologies, but for the purpose of this talk, I'll use mine. Front-end evaluation. That's the part that in some other places one might want to call marketing. But front-end evaluation is really the point where I try to understand my audiences. What do they know? What do they not know? What do they care about? It's a brief, in brief, it's my basic deep understanding of who I'm serving. The second part is the next stage when I start designing things to help them, an activity, an exhibition, a program, a talk, a Nova show. Formative evaluation is the stage in which I basically design this with evidence. How do elements of my design work and how can I improve them? And I use audience research to do this. By the way, the whole idea of audience research is the notion that if I have all these designers and all these people creating a show at the table, I can't have all my audience at the table as well to tell me something. Hence, I have a researcher who is the voice of the audience at that design table. This is in the design stage. Once I've done my design and the activity is done, I can actually test it in situ, so to say. Is the idea of remedial evaluation. It's not a good term. People don't like it so much. Is the notion that once it exists, and before I really go to the final version of it, I can test it with real audiences and still make improvements. And at the end of the day, I do a summative evaluation in which I try to find out oftentimes, does it work? That's a simple question. The more complex one is, what worked for who, in what ways, and why? That's a good evaluation question, though complex and takes money. The difference between evaluation and research is, I think, something one should point out. And it also has to do with the idea that each one of those stages requires different kind of evidence to make a point. And I think that's been said before. In research, I try, and I lead a lot of evidence for that, to generalize something to larger populations. In an evaluation, I oftentimes want to find out about a specific activity. The level of evidence I need in order to do that is slightly different from that of generalizable research, particularly in the beginning part. I'll give you an example, the rule of 10, I'd say rule of 8. If you want to find out whether in an exhibit, for instance, a certain kind of element works well for the audience, how often does somebody have to tell you they didn't understand to press that button before you actually realize you have to do something about it? Do you have to have a randomized control trial for that? No. So it is really important to distinguish at each stage what element or what kind of evidence do I need in order to do my work. The other thing that's important, I want to know, do you all know what this is? It's a logic model, a program model. It's just one representation of the notion that before I begin to do a good systematic way of designing an activity, so that I start thinking systematically about where I want to go. What's the mission or the impact I want to have with this? And I can map backwards when I know my audience. What do I want to have happening to my audience so that it can be aggregated to this kind of impact? I want to understand really deeply what is it that I'm creating in order to make that happen, and I want to know what resources I have to make this happen. And the important part here is these are linked. This is not the way most people develop this stuff. It's far too logical. But it helps you actually develop evaluation studies, and one of the benefits of evaluation studies is that I at least begin to think systematically of what I'm doing. The first example I want to give is the Current Science and Technology Center as it was devised at the Museum of Science in Boston. And the person who is brainchild to a degree and who is a leader in this, is Carolyn Alpert, who is sitting here in the audience, and if you want to know anything more about this, you can talk with her later, because she also has a lot to say about nanoscience, informal science, education, and how to do this, and experiments a lot with ways in which scientists can communicate with the public. But broadly speaking, this is an installation at the Museum of Science where you had a multimedia stage connected in an open area in the middle of the museum, connected to an exhibit area, surrounded by a news band, and involved in lots of different activities. And the main idea here was to say, how can we get current science into a museum, making use of the idea that there is an interaction between what's in the media and what a museum could feature. In other words, people come ready to hear about something that's current and in the news and get it much better explained than the media can normally do in the museum. And you can see it also go the other way around, because at some point they actually fed the media themselves. The point here was in order to evaluate this, we had to do multiple ways of thinking about a project of this nature, because the project was based on a partnership between the museum, science-based institutions, and the scientists themselves. The main idea here was, and the corporate world actually, the main idea here was not to invite every time an individual scientist and train them and have them do something, but to have an infrastructure developed that allows researchers to get better in what they do and to find a platform where they can communicate their science. And that helps actually, by the way, where the audience is. The Science Museum clearly is a place where people like to hear about this kind of stuff. So one of the things that we had to figure out more is, how do visitors respond to this? How do they behave in this environment? Are they accepting this? Are they coming to this? And what do they benefit? How do they benefit from this kind of interaction with researchers at an institution like the Museum of Science in Boston? Authentic, real researchers, not interpreters. For the museum itself, the question was, how can we improve the practice? Because they were experimenting with something. How can we make sure that the process itself, having something that's quite different in a museum setting, work with the museum itself? And then, of course, if you're investing heavily in this kind of work, you want to know what the results are so that you can document that and go to funders potentially in other places and say, you should try this, it works. And ultimately, they had partners in the scientific institutions in the Boston area that are partnering, and they're spending their time and effort. Is it worth it? In what ways is it worth it? And if it all works together, you have a program that can sustain itself. And we used various methods to make that happen. Instead of front-end audience research, we actually did lit reviews, which is also what you can do. We did all sorts of ways of finding out whether the events can be improved, from live events where you have speakers, where we observed and used criteria for how the speaking scientist or interpreter can improve, all the way to talk aloud protocols at touch screens that were there, where we try to find out the think aloud protocols, where we find out what people do. It was all based on the idea that with evidence we can improve what happens on the floor and in the museum. At the end, there were a variety of ways in which we tried to show that this, and in what way this process actually led to benefits to the audience, to the institution, and to the science organization themselves, using all sorts of methods. I'm not going to go into the details of results here, but to say that if you do this kind of work, improving the way in which the scientists can communicate helps in the way that the scientists communicate. They're open to that. You can actually try and talk to them, which many people here have done. But more importantly, if you do something like this, you need to build a trusted partnership between institutions that allow you to minimize the transaction cost of constantly having to do this from the bottom up. This was then taken to the next step in another project where I was a co-PI on the research on what we call Portal to the Public. This is a process of systematically trying to find a model that would work in science centers and science museums to bring the same idea, scientists in partnership with local communities and research organizations, to bring current science to various types of publics. This was then based on some kind of underlying model. Even the evaluation was based on a model. And we tried to actually create a model that would allow other science centers and science museums to understand what the elements are that they can adopt, because every situation is different. Why is every situation different? In the Pacific Science Center, where this idea came from, they began this by having kind of science fair and science festivals at their museum, at the Science Center itself, where they invited scientists from the various types of research organizations in the Seattle area to talk about current science in this area. Explora in Albuquerque had a completely different philosophy. They are very radical, hands-on, minds-on, constructivist, let the people play with scientific investigations, because they want the students to realize that they are curious and that they can play with ideas. Very different, more exploratorium, but taking it to the next extreme. And at the North Museum, a very traditional natural history museum, there the notion was far more the idea of bringing local scientists in the Lancaster area into a museum, primarily for the purpose of showing the audience that they are researchers in their community, addressing the idea that people ought to be able to name a researcher. All of them were aiming at the notion and at the idea that researchers are your neighbors. And that was one of the other components of this work. Again, we had a variety of research questions that were guiding this kind of work. You see a few here, but the majority of them are basically asking, does the model work? How can we optimize this? And how can you then have enough information that others could potentially pick it up and make it happen? Is it sustainable is a question of value. Will research institutions continue to partner, and will museums continue to have that as a core concept of what they think they are, bringing current science and researchers into their institutions? We used multiple methods, from visitor surveys and visitor observations, to address all stages of this research. And I want to mention one thing about this, a specific method. We recorded conversations at tables where researchers were trained to actually interact with 12-year-olds in a hands-on way. Imagine a Sandia Mountain, not Sandia Mountain, a Sandia Lab researcher working on advanced material science, trying to translate what they do so that a 10-year-old in a science museum can understand it. They helped them do this, but how do you evaluate that? We decided to bet the burden on us and record the conversations that happened at this table between the scientist and the children. And then, emerging from this kind of conversation, find out the degree to which both of them benefited and in what ways from this kind of interaction. We certainly worked a lot with the researchers and the science educators to find out what worked for them in the training and in the way in which they implemented these programs. Most importantly, we also included the leadership in all these organizations to find out the degree to which these kinds of interactions between museums and science-based institutions and their scientists benefited each side. And then we validated that by actually transporting this to 5 sites that were not intimately involved in this to see how well it worked. The basic idea here is cost-benefit analysis. We found that everyone in this particular way of structuring a partnership saw positive net value, but what's important here is that for each one, that the visitors and the communities saw value primarily in the notion that you have an authentic researcher here interacting with my child, with me, precisely the notion that they normally don't encounter them, even if they're their neighbors. And that these researchers were trained and had developed their materials so well that it was understandable, which created not only trust, but the notion that these are people I can talk to. It was incredibly valuable to the audience, and that was actually the key to having everybody else think it was valuable, because that was the part of the equation, both for the scientists as well as for the museums, that this is an important thing to do. The scientists certainly said the main cost, as you probably know, is the time required to do it. But the benefits were personal and professional, in a sense that we oftentimes reached young, early career scientists and researchers who deeply cared that the public should know about this kind of work. And they gave quite a bit of effort into this. And when that happened, once they were at the stage where they felt comfortable interacting with people, that was an important part. They wanted to do it again, which is why the one-off material oftentimes doesn't work. The informal science institutions certainly have as a main cost staff time, so you have to think about what else you're not doing if you want to make this a sustainable model. But the main benefit for them certainly was the idea that their staff improved themselves, their scientific understanding, and in teaching it to scientists, they became better educators and communicators themselves. The visitors' benefits was important to them. But the other thing that was important to them as institutions was that they began to have sustained relationships with science-based institutions in their neighborhood, which gives authenticity to them as institutions within their community, which is what they documented. We had them actually document that through a media kind of scrapbook that they had to develop. Now, the question that I had, how can we make this type of work the norm? Ed was mentioning this first thing, right? We need funding. You probably have heard the idea that at least at the current projected budget, a lot of funding for informal science education and communication has been cut dramatically throughout various federal agencies, which shows us that there's currently certainly not a positive perspective on this kind of work. I think accountability helps. If we realize increasingly more, and if researchers realize increasingly more, that they will be required to ask themselves a hard question of whether the work they do is understood and has some impact, it would be useful to actually get this type of thinking about accountability into people's heads. Then reflecting on whether this accountability that they are replying to is actually important to them would lead us to think that they value it. I think it's almost like it's a cultural change in which you will then be willing, and more people will be willing to engage in the kinds of partnerships I described. I think it's important that we can communicate to many researchers that most people who took part in these partnerships were extraordinarily satisfied with the work they did. And hopefully they realize that in engaging with the public, they can find support if we get these kinds of projects growing across the country, and that will change their culture. The culture of thinking about engaging in this kind of work and having it be subject to evaluation and regular improvement. Of course, what's helpful is to have more of these Sackler symposia so we can talk about this. Or, of course, the thing we don't want people to come away with, that we should continue to wing it. I hope we realize we shouldn't be doing that. Thank you.